One of the most jarring moments of waking up I've ever experienced was when I first moved here to Vietnam and I discovered the modern legacy of the Vietnam-American War, or one of the most famous US interventions in history. I still remember that moment. When I was on a ninth grade trip, that was the first year I was in this country, and we walked through this area called Cannon Fort, which was a military holdout during the war in the region of Cap Ba in Vietnam. And I remember walking through the trenches and along artillery and just remembering and just understanding that US intervention in Vietnam was not something that was remembered as a moment of liberation, but rather of the opposite, in which liberty was taken. This was a very jarring moment for me because as a Korean American, I grew up in the States, understanding that US troops around the world valiantly worked towards and contributed to the peace and security of not only US citizens, but citizens around the world, defending democracies around the world. And in Korea, I saw that firsthand for myself, walking through the Jeongha garrison, where over 10,000 US troops are stationed, helping to keep the peace in Vietnam. I also walked with my grandparents through the Korean War Memorial, learning about the anecdotes of soldiers from a variety of countries, including the US and Korea, who valiantly fought for the freedom of the Korean Peninsula. And I think this contrasts what was so jarring to me, and it really prompted me to wake up and ask the question, why was it that the US intervention in Vietnam ended up so differently than it had in Korea? And I think what this talk I hope to convey isn't just about the historical analysis of the US interventions of Korea and Vietnam being different, but really, I think waking up is such an important phenomenon. The reason being, for one, everyone in this crowd, everyone around the world has already woken up to new ideas, perspectives, just different ways of looking at things, and they'll probably continue to do so. And I think it's worthwhile just examining when we do wake up, how this changes us, how it changes the way we look at things. Because for me, delving into the journey of researching why was it these two interventions were so different really taught me a lot of lessons about myself, a lot about the lessons that I think maybe I should start applying to my own life. And I think this exactly of how I researched it and how I came to learn about new things is exactly what I want to share today. So the start of my journey of research came when I came back from the War Museum here in Hanoi, and I just looked up some basic facts. And really what jarred me in the beginning was that the interventions were so similar, right? Like there are two key similarities that I found. Number one is I just looked up, right? Like why were these conflicts started in the first place, right? And I discovered that they were proxy wars for the Cold War, a war of nerves, not of actual conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States with some involvement of China. And I noticed that the Vietnam War and Korean War were heavily linked to this and is seen as one of the crucial proxy wars of this larger conflict. So that was the first similarity that I found. The second similarity, oddly enough, was that there was a pro-US faction in the South with a presidential democracy system very similar to that of the US. And what was interesting to me was I first got into researching this to understand what was different, yet I was finding a lot of similarities. And more than that, I think it's precisely that there are similarities between these two conflicts that are very compelling is what makes the fact that these conflicts became so different or had such different outcomes such an important thing to look at, and also something that we can learn from, and definitely I've learned from. And with that researching, I came up with three crucial differences that led to three different lessons emerging. The first difference was simply found through asking the question after finding the similarities of, okay, so who exactly was it fighting in these conflicts? Because I had some prior knowledge, the fact that, the Vietnam War and the Korean War had a little bit of difference of who was involved. And I looked at the Korean War just on a list of belligerents, as it's called in some war profiles, that 21 different countries, including the US, actually were allies of the South Korean side. That is to say that they not only had a lot of this international consensus, but they also actually, interestingly enough, were under a United Nations command. And what I found so interesting about this was how different that was from who exactly did the invading in Vietnam. Yes, the US contributed the most troops in both conflicts, but I think it's worthy to note the US didn't have as wide of a coalition when they intervened in Vietnam, nor did they have this kind of international legitimacy coming from, I think, something like a UN command. And from this, I found two distinct impacts. The first impact of this difference in diversity of who was doing the intervention was that in the Korean War, talks for ceasefire happened and ended far quicker than in the Vietnam War. The Korean War had started in 1950, and because of a wide coalition of countries, talks for ceasefires actually ended by 1953, effectively ending the brunt of the conflict. In contrast, the Vietnam War actually took 20 years to fight, in which the U.S. Mostly wrestled with the diplomatic issues, such as the kind of concessions and the kind of deals that were made. And I think it's crucial to notice that the wider diversity of countries involved in the intervention made sure that a ceasefire was actually easier to reach. The second impact I got from this difference was the fact that on an organizational level, conduct was far more unfortunate in Vietnam. What I mean by this is that on an organizational level, conduct was far more regulated during the Korean War, given there was such a diversity of countries and there was a system of check and balance that had to span not just one country or a few countries' militaries, but a large countries. And even though, yes, the Korean War still has its share of infamous atrocities, I think a crucial difference is that from an organizational level, for instance, the use of weapons of mass destruction like chemical weapons like Agent Orange, which I interestingly discovered through service organizations here in Hanoi, still battling with the modern legacies of the phenomena. In the Vietnam War, you saw far more instances of these kinds of atrocities being committed. I think more individually, I just thought of what I had found, which is that, obviously, as I said, the Korean War had a wider diversity of people and countries assisting the US. And I think what I learned from that is that maybe if I'm working in a team of people, maybe if I'm working alongside other people, that it's very much worthwhile to surround myself with a diverse group of people, because it helps check and balance ideas, it helps check and balance the actions that I take, and there's a lot to learn from different perspectives. So I think in this moment of Wake Up, I learned really the value of surrounding yourself with a group of very different people from yourself. The second difference I discovered between the two conflicts was the question of who exactly did the US work with on the ground in Vietnam and Korea? Who was their ally in the southern regions of both countries? Because I think it was worthwhile, the first question of who exactly was intervening, now it's worthwhile to understand who was helping them on the ground. Because in Korea, I discovered the first president of Korea, in fact, Syngman Rhee, was the point man for the United States, who was an independency advocate for the South Korean side against Japanese colonialism. I also discovered, by looking up the belligerents in the Vietnam War, that the U.S.'s partner was a man named No Zing-Ziam, who was a minister of actually the imperial family and actually had been living in exile until the U.S. brought him back. The crucial difference that I found here was that Syngman Rhee had far more connections to key figures in the military. He was seen as a person who had contributed to the liberation of Korea from Japanese occupancy, and furthermore helped the U.S. bolster their image as a liberator of the Korean Peninsula from Japanese colonialism. This was quite different when we examined No Zing-Ziam, who not only struggled with his counterparts in the military, but also didn't share this kind of liberator image, as he had actually been self-exiled from the country, not very connected to affairs, until the U.S. had helped appoint him prime minister. And I think the reason why I think this was important to examine was that these people had different abilities to rule and have legitimacy among the people within these countries. And the way I observed this was I researched the guerrilla groups fighting conflicts within these regions. That is to say, civilian groups that took up arms against the government. And I saw the most keen one being the donkey squads in the Korean War resisted the North Koreans. But in Vietnam, the Viet Cong were the most prominent guerrilla group, resisted the South. Meaning that during the Korean War, the South Korean government had far more legitimacy than the North, but in the Vietnam, it was the opposite. And I think what I learned from this observation was that perhaps if the U.S. had worked with someone else maybe who had been more popular in the South in Vietnam, maybe they would have had more legitimacy. But I think I woke up more when I was like, maybe I should be trying to look at the character or the kinds of people that I work with. And as much as the people around me being diverse is important, as I learned earlier, maybe it's important to understand, the character of these people as much as the kinds of, efficacy they could bring to a group effort, or something along those lines. So I think that's a second wake up I've had. The third point of difference and wake up I had was just understanding the kind of commitment that the U.S. had put into both countries. In Korea, this was something I actually knew before the research. Over 28,000 troops actually are stationed in Korea, doing joint trainings, helping the peace, monitoring areas like the demilitarized zone. But in Vietnam, they actually withdrew in 1973, with Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falling in 1975. And what I found important here was just a simple lesson of commitment, that if I wanted to do something, I should stay committed in the long term. And I connected this to something that actually happened very recently, in which U.S. intervention in Afghanistan had actually fallen as soon as the U.S. had left. And I think a broad lesson I just learned was one of persistence, that I ought to persist and to keep on trying for something that I believe in, that I would like. I think conclusively, yes, I think all in all, conclusively, I learned three important differences that helped me answer, I guess, the historical question I wanted to know of why was the Vietnam War and the Korean War so different. I definitely learned there. But I think what was far more key for me in this process was learning the personal lessons. Things like, for example, surrounding myself with a diverse group of people. Things like, understanding the importance of the character of people. I think also, persisting and having long-term commitments to things that I really believe in. And I think the reason why I think this is such an important thing I wanted to share is because I think no matter what kind of field or area of knowledge where we wake up, I think there's always something that can help us be better if we can really think hard enough or look hard enough at exactly what we are waking up to.